We had staining on instruments. We had particulate on instruments. We didn't know where it was coming from. And then we found out that the municipality was working on the water supply line down the street. And as they dug up that line, material and particulate just started to break away on the piping and got fed in through that water supply line.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now, turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
On this Vendor Spotlight, we speak with Mark Munroe, Vice President of Strategic Projects and Mobile Solutions at STERIS. And this is really a part two. We're going to be continuing the conversation that we had on the first Spotlight titled To the Rescue, a mobile sterile processing solution designed with continuity in mind. And Mark gave us a nice overview of mobile SPD. And one of the best practices that he recommended on that initial Spotlight was to really prepare as much as possible. There's lots of stakeholders that get involved when you're trying to deploy a mobile SPD. And so in this conversation, we're going to kind of leap off from that and talk about emergency situations where time and preparation might be more of a luxury, and all of a sudden cases are going to be canceled, procedures are going to be stopped, revenue is going to be stopped. And so what can we do to move things along as quickly as possible? We're going to hear some really interesting stories today, and then also we're going to talk about some alternatives and what you can do at your facilities to be more prepared in the event of an emergency that might impact your department and shut down the operating room. So we're going to be right back after a short break with Mark Munroe.
From 17 studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Mark Munroe, Vice President of Strategic Projects and Mobile Solutions at STERIS. And Mark, this is going to be your second appearance. And when we spoke last time on our episode titled To the Rescue, a mobile sterile processing solution designed with continuity in mind, we really left off the conversation talking about how preparation is so key when you're trying to successfully deploy a mobile SPD. But we teed up this episode by saying we don't always have that luxury. And while it would be nice to be able to put everything together in time, sometimes we're going to run into some emergencies, and timing is going to be critical. And so today we're really going to go into that conversation in more details around how are we successful when we do find ourselves in an emergency situation and need to utilize mobile SPD. So thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Yeah, Justin, great to be back here with you. And this is kind of the fun stuff when we start talking about the challenges, the crisis situations, and as you mentioned, the inability to plan. Because I think in sterile processing, we like to move through a normal cadence. We like to have a typical plan of what our day is going to look like, what our week is going to look like, how we're going to satisfy the surgery schedule. And sometimes you just run into situations that throw all of that out the window. So looking forward to sharing some of those that we've experienced over the years.
Well, I know when we kicked off the last episode, and I do want to point everybody in that direction because it follows a really nice flow. So definitely listen to the first episode after you listen to this one or in consecutive order. But we talked about your background, but I was hoping that you could just introduce yourself to the audience again for anybody who may be picking it up for this episode before having listened to the other one.
Yeah, happy to do it. So I joined STERIS about 8 years ago, and at that time, we did not have the world of mobile solutions at STERIS. It was something that a few of us had thought about for a number of years, and it was just the timing was right. It was time to give our customers a solution to help them through, as we talked about, what we originally thought was going to just be the renovation space. And as you mentioned, renovations give us a lot of time to plan, but it's those crisis situations that we realized are making up a fair amount of our business because we don't always have the time to plan. So I've been with STERIS about 8 years. I've been in healthcare my entire career on the business side of healthcare, but I'm also one of those rare individuals who has been in the mobile side of healthcare for the better part of about 15 years. So whether it's deploying mobile units in North America or across the globe, even over into the Middle East, myself and my team have had some pretty interesting experiences over the years.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I suppose we'll have to save that story for another day, but you've piqued my curiosity. So I'll have to ask you when we get together sometime. Why don't you start this conversation, since you said in the last episode and kind of reminded us just now about the fact that originally designed more for that renovation planning and making sure that there's a way to keep up with surgeries. Now we're moving into this emergency or maybe even disaster scenario. What are those situations like? What do you run into most commonly that you would qualify as an emergent situation for a hospital or healthcare system?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, it's going to sound a little bit ironic, but a lot of times it still has to do with planning or lack thereof. So you always, even during a scheduled renovation, you try to put the best plan together. But that plan gets thrown out the window sometimes when you start throwing a hammer into the department. And I'll give you a really good example that we see more often than not, and it's not that architects don't always plan appropriately, but sometimes when you start opening up the wall or you start demoing the floor, all of a sudden you realize you're in a space that was built 25, 30 years ago. And back then we used to use this stuff called asbestos to kind of hold everything together. And as we talked about in the first episode, contaminants in SPD are not a good thing. Boy, asbestos in SPD is definitely not a good thing. So we often run into these scenarios where we talk to a customer that thinks about mobile in their overall plan. And then for one reason or another, they decide that they're going to try to do the renovation the old school way, which we call phasing that renovation. And they move into, sometimes they'll get through the clean side renovation will go really well. And then they move into decon and all of a sudden they run into that asbestos situation. And we've had that happen numerous times. And they remember, oh, geez, we'll just call those guys at mobile and they'll come back in and, give us an option. And all that planning has to go out the window. So they've run into that kind of crisis situation with that side of the plan because it was just something that was unknown. So asbestos is a great example of that. We've also seen, because for those of us who are near and dear to sterile processing, we know it's typically probably 99% of the time in the basement or in the lowest level of the hospital. And we've often run across scenarios where the piping in the basement that goes under SPD or is picked up by SPD is built, again, 20 some odd years ago when they laid cast iron pipe underneath the foundation. And all of a sudden that piping isn't there anymore. And you have to really kind of work to understand how are we going to renovate on top of that. So we've had scenarios where customers will call us and say, we've started in on our renovation and the drain pipe underneath the department has now collapsed. And we don't know what to do. Now we have to go into the floor. We have to really get into an invasive scenario.
So would you describe that as like a last minute? I know we talked about renovation, but plan for renovation. And in this case, you're saying the renovation or the discovery of a minor project leads to a last minute renovation. Like they have no options but to renovate at that point. They just weren't able to plan on their side.
Yeah, it's both. It's the scenario where the renovation causes the problem because they're working above it. And it's also the scenario sometimes where it was just unknown and they knew that the drain line was underneath there, but they didn't understand the structure or the structure lack thereof that now doesn't exist. And really what happens is they now have to do something much more invasive than they had originally planned. And the renovation has to stop, right? Immediately when you collapse the drain pipe for the hospital, everything has to cease. So now it's not only how do we phase, but it's how do we fix the problem that we've created? And then how do we get back to the environment that we need to be in?
What about things like staining with instruments? I mean, when you talk about that piping and it's old, can that old infrastructure also result into issues with the instruments just not being able to be maintained in a certain quality, or even just the water itself is, very hard water just based on the infrastructure like the piping?
It's funny when you use the word staining, guys like us kind of cringe a little bit because there's so many different reasons for staining that happens. And then, as you well know, staining and instruments is an instant crisis because when do you discover the staining? You discover it at the back table when you're opening up and getting ready for the case. And of course, the patient's already been prepped. And now we have a big problem, right? So staining can come from a lot of different reasons. And when I tag it into crisis situations that drive these calls to us for a mobile SPD, I'll give you two great examples. We ran into a scenario one time where, and again, this is just straight preventative maintenance. The facility team decided that they were going to clean the steam lines that service the hospital. And they probably knew that those steam lines also serviced SPD, but they didn't really know the big impact of what was happening. Well, when you clean steam lines, you typically do that through a chemical process. And when you clean those lines, particulate is typically going to be released from the actual piping. And where does that particulate end up? It ends up in the sterilizers. And if the washers are fed by steam, it ends up there. But ultimately, it ends up on the instruments. So again, a standard procedure or process that's designed to improve created the problem. And sometimes it's self-induced, just like that, where the facility team is trying to do something to benefit the overall facility and creates the challenge. And sometimes it's just not even controlled by the facility whatsoever. We had a customer who called us, again, panic situation. We had staining on instruments. We had particulate on instruments. We didn't know where it was coming from. And then we found out that the municipality was working on the water supply line down the street. And as they dug up that line, material and particulate just started to break away on the piping and got fed in through that water supply line. And where did those particulates end up? They ended up in the instrument trays. So again, now they have to deal with not only infrastructure issues, but equipment issues. And I'll tell you, when you start dealing with those scenarios, then you deal with backlog. And that's another thing that we have customers call us on a lot. And backlog can happen. I think you understand what I'm saying, backlog with having to reprocess trays because we just don't know if they are contaminated or not. And I'll give you a sort of flows right into this process. You know, we've had a few customers over the years who call us because their HVAC in sterile storage goes out of specification. And all of a sudden it's very warm in sterile storage, or it's very humid in sterile storage. And what's in there? All of those trays that now have to be reprocessed. So as much as we would love to say that every hospital in this country is designed with the ability to take up backlog or to have additional capacity, we all know the reality, right? Those departments are running at 120, 130% day in and day out. So when all of a sudden you realize you have to reprocess 1,000 trays, open them all up, run them through the washers, run them through the sterilizers, it's not a simple process. Most organizations and most departments are not built to be able to handle that. So we've had to bring in mobile units to be able to just deal with backlog. And sometimes that requires additional staffing, sometimes not. But, you know, here at STERIS, we're lucky that we have the luxury to be able to offer that whole suite of services when those issues exist.
What I really never considered there, and it's a really important distinction, you might get a problem solved fairly quickly, like the issue you described in sterile storage, and be able to get everything back online and going. The problem is the rework. As you said, that entire inventory in sterile storage has to be redone. And no matter what, if you're going with your existing capacities, then that's going to take a long time, especially if you're returning to a normal surgical caseload. And if you don't, then you're losing revenue. So I can see where that mobile SPD is so critical for just getting caught back up on the rework. So I guess if I'm a manager or I'm somebody in the department and all of a sudden one of these emergencies comes up, things start to get a little, I don't know, tenuous, right? There's a lot of stress on the organization. Peri-op maybe also, because they're impacted, maybe also stressing out pretty substantially. I'm sure it goes all the way to the top of the organization because surgical services is the largest revenue generator in the hospital. And so things get pretty crazy. And I can say sometimes when things are stressful like that, it's hard to sort of think clearly. And in a situation like this, you might not have ever faced it before. And it's certainly not something you face routinely. So as everybody that's listening to this podcast, kind of hearing your insight, you're the expert. You've been through this before. What should they be keeping in mind if this all of a sudden pops up on them and they're in crisis mode and they're trying to keep a level head and get through it as quickly and as safely as possible? What should be rattling around in their brains?
You know, it's a great question. And unfortunately, there's no simple answer. But what I tell customers all the time is just pick up the phone and call us. We've been through pretty much every scenario you can think of. And sometimes, and this may sound a little bit strange to our listeners, sometimes it's not what you think the solution needs to be. In a lot of crisis situations, the first phone call we get is, we need a mobile SPD here tomorrow. And when we start to unpack where that request comes from, we realize that's not what they need. They may need to augment their staffing to run a third shift in order to be able to get caught up on their backlog. They may need some consulting services to come in because they have an operational problem that they're working through. Or sometimes they may just need some help with logistics. Maybe they're a facility that has a sister facility down the street that can help them reprocess, but they don't know how to get those instruments to and from that location. So I know this is challenging for some of the listeners because when you think about picking up the phone and calling an organization like STERIS, sometimes you see it more as a supplier relationship phone call. And a lot of times we can help because we've been through it before. It may not be a perfect one-to-one example, but we can at least let customers think through different options. And I think to your point, when it happens to you for the first time, you really feel like you're out on an island or you're just hanging by the last limb on the tree. And knowing that there are people who can bring some calm to the situation and maybe offer up 2, 3, sometimes even 4 different options to help you get out of the challenge that you're in can be comforting, because it doesn't always have to be one answer to what that challenge may be.
I love that there are alternatives and that you're going to partner with them to look for those alternatives. And I think one of the reasons is deploying a mobile SPD may not be something that can be done very quickly, as we discussed on the last episode, which is why we talked about all the proper planning and being able to get lots of different internal stakeholders involved. But what are some challenges to quick deployment? Like, let's lay that out real specifically too.
So I would say the biggest challenge is full and open communication. Why are we doing this? And how do we get to a solution? And what I mean by that is, you brought it up. Sometimes leadership isn't involved until the crisis is really, really boiling over. So you need to bring in all facets of that whole perioperative loop. That's the first thing that I would say is important around the communication side. The second one is external communication. So there are going to be third parties, authorities having jurisdiction over what we're going to do, that need to be in the loop. And they can stop the process as fast as they can be supportive of the process. So I often find that there's an advanced discussion that needs to happen. Here's the problem that we're dealing with. Here's the solution we're going to put in place to get ourselves through it. And we're going to need to have some help expediting some of that solution. So having those conversations with the authorities having jurisdiction are vitally important. And then it gets down to the nuts and bolts, right? Do we have enough utility, infrastructure, support to be able to host something like a mobile SPD? And we don't do this as part of, the course for a planned construction renovation, but sometimes we just need to put an advanced team literally on site, on the campus, right there, sitting next to the facility team, sitting next to infection prevention. Because if you're doing this for the first time, it's going to feel foreign. It's going to feel scary. There's going to be a lot of questions that you're going to have on demand. And it's much more comforting to have somebody physically there who can help answer those questions and help kind of steer and guide the process as you move through it. So if I had to boil it down to just one word of, what is the best way to be able to move through this as quickly as possible, it's really focused around communication and making sure that all the stakeholders know how they fit in. And when they're called upon, it's not sort of the standard response that we're looking for. When we call to facilities, we need to know that we are calling because we need support right now. When we call an outside contractor that the hospital works with for things like utilities, they need to know that we're in a crisis situation. This is not something that we're thinking about. It's something that we have to recover from.
That's interesting. And I hadn't really thought about the authorities that have jurisdiction in this case. That's really kind of important because they could be external. They may be internal as well, but they could be external. And so to your point, communicating that it's a crisis situation so that those external authorities are kind of understanding what is really happening to the organization that delivers, healthcare to the entire community. I mean, that's really what they have to be able to take away from that is, yes, this is a support service that really can't go down. We need this hospital to be running. So we talked a little bit about things that, the frontline staff and managers in sterile processing could be thinking about, especially when faced with something that's a surprise and in a crisis and the tensions can be high. But what about things that can be done proactively? Like what can facilities, and I don't even just mean sterile processing, what should be in place throughout these healthcare facilities across the country to help them be prepared to deal with, emergencies and disasters as they present themselves?
So it's a great question. I think one of the things that I see often overlooked is every facility has a crisis plan. And good facilities exercise that crisis plan. So when the actual crisis happens, they're not pulling the plan off the shelf and trying to run it at that point. They're actually going through an exercise that they're familiar with. If I was in charge of a department, if I was in charge of sterile processing, I would ask my leadership, is sterile processing part of a disaster management plan? What happens if all of a sudden we cannot reprocess instruments at this facility? What is the plan? Because it will become a disaster or a crisis very quickly when I have to make that phone call to the head of peri-op and say, we can't support the operating rooms anymore. That will become crisis number one at that facility. So what I like to see, and as someone who's been through a lot of these over the years, whether they're natural disasters, whether they're self-induced, or whether they're just situations that happen through lack of planning, what I often find is if you've role-played a scenario, whether you've exercised it or not, you at least have a plan that you can fall back on. And sometimes that plan is calling STERIS and finding out how they can help us. But that doesn't really need to be the first call. The first call needs to be to the leadership team to be able to say, do we have a plan if sterile processing is not functioning at this facility, and what does that plan look like? So it's a little bit proactive, and I understand, again, sterile processing is one of those departments that runs at 150% all the time. So taking a time out to ask the questions and role play what would happen is not something that's top of mind for most departments. But if you have the plan and you know that you're comfortable exercising it, it's well worth the investment in time. If nothing else, make sure it's part of the overall facility plan.
It's funny when you talk about the role playing, that is really critical. And there are lots of examples of role play. I mean, fire drills are a great example of role plays when, a disaster happens. And when I think about role playing, it's usually something like a fire drill, or it might be, a major disaster, like a huge, car pile up, plane crash. And you think about all these life-saving scenarios that healthcare systems role play for and communicate around. And that's really their focal point, just like you said about communication to be able to deploy mobile SPD quickly. A lot of the life-saving kind of role playing is around communicating from all these different departments and pieces to the puzzle. But I never really thought of role playing in terms of, talking about essentially an unforeseen cause of shutting down SPD. It's like the role play almost has to be somewhat generalized, does it not?
Yeah, it does, because what you described is all around patient care, right? Those role plays that typically happen are all focused around patient care. And there's a whole infrastructure world that supports patient care, right? And SPD is part of that. And there's infrastructure that supports SPD. So I think it's vitally important to take a look at all of that as you role play your bigger scenarios, because it's one thing if you can't treat a patient because of, as you described, a massive car pileup or an airplane crash. It's a whole nother thing if all of a sudden you can't support the perioperative loop and what is actually happening. And you described it, right? Surgery is the lifeblood of the hospital. And when that stops, everything stops. And everything gets focused very, very quickly. So that's what I was referring to when I said, role playing that side of it is sometimes you just have to take a step back and think about what happens when the infrastructure doesn't work.
Well, Mark, that's another really, really good point, especially right now. We talk about the OR being the lifeblood of the hospital, but with so many cancellations of procedures, everybody's still trying to catch up, especially on those elective cases. And so we talked about backlog in terms of reworking in the event of a disaster, having to reprocess all those trays. But many hospitals are still dealing with a backlog of surgeries that need to happen. And so even as we talk about revenue on one hand of it, it really is about serving the community. And every time those surgical volumes go down, that backlog of surgeries that we still haven't caught up with continues to get pushed back. So that was a really good point you just made. As we're kind of wrapping up, I guess I'd like you to get me excited even more about mobile SPD from the standpoint of, this is something you've been doing in a career spanning 15 years in mobile. So you've seen a lot evolve over time. What does the future hold for mobile SPD?
Yeah, Justin, it's a great question. So as you know, and as our audience knows, we did a pretty significant acquisition in the relative recent past. And I'm referring to the team and the organization at Cantel. So for those of you who have kind of watched the world of mobile solutions here at STERIS, you know that endoscopy is very much an important part of the portfolio now. So as many can probably guess, there are great things coming, more units, certainly in the mobile SPD fleet, but with the advent and the addition of Cantel to the STERIS portfolio, one can only imagine what's probably going to be coming down the pike as we continue to build out the fleet and enter into new modalities in the world of mobile processing.
All right. Well, I just want to remind everybody to check out your first episode titled To the Rescue, a mobile sterile processing solution designed with continuity in mind. That's already out on the Beyond Clean podcast feed. You can also follow STERIS Healthcare Products on LinkedIn. Visit STERIS University to earn free CEs. And you can learn more about the STERIS Mobile Sterile Processing Unit by visiting steris.com/mobile SPD. Mark, once again, you did a fantastic job with this interview and really helping everybody out there know what they can do to prepare for emergencies. I love the role playing. I think that's critical. And to know that, hey, mobile isn't always the answer, but when it is, these are some things that you can do to make sure that a quick deployment is even possible. And it always comes down to communication. Nice job, Mark. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Justin. Look forward to catching up with you in the future.
That was Mark Munroe, Vice President of Strategic Projects and Mobile Solutions at STERIS. We continued the conversation from our first spotlight with Mark talking about the mobile sterile processing unit, but in this context, really looking at emergency situations that arise. And as Mark talked about, it's not always easy to deploy a mobile SPD super quick. So having some other options that to be considered, and I love the tip around role playing, knowing if you have sister facilities that can support, or on-site, some quick turn centers. That way, not all procedures have to be canceled. Maybe you postpone some of those elective procedures and then reach out to Mark and his team and the expertise that they have at STERIS so that you can consider whether or not mobile SPD is the right fit for you. But that's going to do it for this vendor spotlight. As a reminder, you can help support Beyond Clean by subscribing to our show on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. You can also find us on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or search for Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes. You just have to download our smartphone app for iPhone and Android. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. Thank you for listening to this vendor spotlight on Beyond Clean.